The morning mist crawled through Windrest like a secret trying to stay hidden, soft and cold against the quiet houses. Elias walked the narrow path alone, as he always did, his silence deeper than the fog around him. Children whispered about him. Adults nodded politely, but no one really knew the weight carried behind his calm eyes. What does a man think about when he has never spoken? And what truths sit inside a heart that has only listened its whole life? Mira skipped along the opposite side of the road, glancing at Elias with the fearless curiosity only a child could hold. Old Tom, leaning on his stick, watched them both like the village itself depended on his eyes. Lyra sorted herbs by her door, while Rowan tried to pretend he wasn't staring at the sky, waiting for rain that wouldn't come. The air felt tight, like the world was holding its breath. A sudden gust rushed through the square, scattering dry leaves, and Elias froze. Something in the wind felt wrong, like a warning no one else could hear. And in that single still moment, every soul in Windrest seemed to sense change approaching, even if they didn't yet understand what it would demand of them. Elias remained still long after the wind faded, his heart beating louder than the quiet around him. The village square seemed to pause with him, as if afraid to disturb whatever he had sensed. Mira stepped closer, her small footsteps soft on the stone. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked all the questions she didn't know how to form. Old Tom muttered something about strange mornings, trying to convince himself nothing was wrong. Lyra watched from her doorway, reading the air the way healers do when storms don't show themselves in the sky. Rowan kicked at a loose stone, pretending not to care but unable to look away. Though no one said it out loud, everyone felt it. The moment had shifted, something unseen had brushed past them, and Elias was the only one who seemed to understand the weight of it. Mira finally found her courage and stepped right in front of Elias, lifting her face to meet his. She didn't ask why he stopped, or what he felt. She simply offered him the kind of look that made even silence feel safe. Elias lowered his head slightly, acknowledging her without words. Old Tom shook his head, pretending he was too busy for such nonsense, but he watched them closely. Lyra stepped farther out into the square, feeling the dryness in the wind and the way it carried no scent of rain. Rowan squinted at the sky again, frustration mixing with worry. The drought was tightening its hold, and everyone could feel the growing tension. Even so, in this small pocket of calm, Mira's quiet presence softened the weight on Elias's shoulders, reminding him that even the silent can be seen. A distant creak echoed through the square as a wooden sign swayed on its hook, reminding everyone of how dry the wind had become. Lyra crossed her arms, troubled by the silence in the air. Rowan stepped back toward the well, staring into its dark center as if searching for answers that weren't there. Old Tom tapped his stick irritably, muttering about the old days when seasons behaved as they should. Mira stayed next to Elias, as though guarding a secret only the two of them could feel. Elias lifted his gaze toward the mountains, the place where the wind had rushed from, and a flicker of something, fear or memory, passed through his eyes. The village was changing, and without a single word spoken, they all felt it tightening around them. A single drop of something, not quite water, not quite dew, fell from the sky and landed on Elias's hand. It shimmered strangely before sinking into his skin. He startled. But the others didn't notice. They were too busy arguing quietly about the failing crops and empty wells. Mira caught the look on Elias's face, sensing what the others missed. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief heartbeat, the world around them seemed to blur. Old Tom raised his voice at Rowan for leaning too far into the well, while Lyra tried to calm him. But Elias no longer heard them. Something old, something he had spent years trying to bury, was beginning to stir. The wind returned with a low, trembling hum, one that carried a message meant only for him. The strange droplet lingered in Elias's thoughts long after it had disappeared into his skin, The wind hummed again, low and unsteady, as if trying to form a word only he could hear. Mira stayed beside him, watching with quiet curiosity. Rowan finally pulled himself away from the well, frustration shadowing his face. Old Tom kept muttering about the sky and its tricks, while Lyra moved with calm purpose, gathering the last of her herbs before the sun climbed higher. The air felt heavier today, as though carrying a message no one knew how to receive. And through it all, Elias felt something inside him shifting, a memory breaking loose, a voice he once buried rising slowly toward the surface. A tense silence settled when Rowan finally blurted out the worry everyone had been avoiding. The well was dropping faster than ever. Old Tom snapped back, insisting the village had survived tougher times, though the wobble in his voice betrayed him. Lyra stepped between them, steady and calm, reminding them that panic never brought rain. Mira tugged gently on Elias's sleeve, trying to draw his attention back to the strange shimmer that had touched him. But Elias's mind drifted elsewhere, to the mountains, to a memory buried in the wind, to a truth he had never dared to speak. The drought wasn't just a hardship. It felt like a warning. Rowan bent over the well again, pulling up the bucket with a strained grunt. When it emerged, splashing lightly, the water line sat frighteningly low. Even old Tom fell silent at the sight. Mira's hand slipped into Elias's without her even noticing, seeking comfort in his presence. Lyra took the bucket, inspecting it with a heavy sigh. The drought was growing worse, and the village was running out of time. Elias closed his eyes briefly, feeling an old ache building behind his ribs. Something deep inside him, something he had locked away for years, began whispering through his memory like a ghost. Lyra set the bucket down and spoke calmly, telling the others they needed to ration what remained. Rowan protested, saying the fields would die before they could save anything. Old Tom scolded him, but even his voice lacked its usual strength. Mira looked up at Elias, sensing that whatever was troubling him was bigger than the drought itself. Elias opened his eyes slowly, his breath unsteady. A flicker of fear crossed his face, followed by something else. Something heavier. The wind stroked past them like a whisper, brushing past Elias's cheeks as though urging him to remember. The air shifted again, this time warmer, almost glowing. Elias felt it before anyone else did. The world around him seemed to fade, replaced by the mountain winds of his childhood, the place where he had lost his voice. He staggered slightly, catching himself on the well's edge. Mira gasped and reached for him. Rowan and Tom paused their argument, startled by Elias's sudden weakness. Lyra stepped forward, concern replacing her calm. For a brief moment, the wind formed a soft tone, almost like a word carried from another time. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came. Not yet, but the village had heard the truth in the silence. Something was coming. Elias steadied himself as the strange warmth faded from his skin. The village felt different now, quieter, as if holding its breath and waiting for him to move. Mira stayed close, her hand resting gently against his arm. Rowan took a hesitant step forward, all frustration gone from his face. Old Tom tilted his head, squinting as though trying to read Elias's thoughts. Lyra studied him carefully, sensing something deeper than simple dizziness. Elias lifted his gaze toward the mountains once more, as if searching for a memory hidden in the wind. No one spoke, but the silence between them felt louder than any argument. The drought was no longer their only worry. Something unseen had awakened, and Elias seemed to be the key to it. Rowan finally broke the heavy silence, asking Elias if he was hurt. But Elias didn't answer. He only pressed his hand to his chest, feeling a familiar ache returning after years of stillness. Mira stepped in front of him, searching his eyes with quiet determination. Old Tom muttered under his breath, claiming the mountains had always been trouble. Lyra ignored the grumbling and asked Elias to sit, but he remained standing, anchored by something stronger than exhaustion. The wind brushed past them again, warm this time, curling around Elias like an old friend calling him home. He swallowed hard. He knew this feeling. It was the same wind that had taken his voice long ago. Lyra stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on Elias's shoulder. She didn't ask questions. She simply waited. Sometimes silence was the only way to let truth rise. Elias closed his eyes again, and a memory flashed in the darkness. A stormy night, a rising wind, a promise he couldn't keep. Mira squeezed his other hand, grounding him. Rowan's curiosity was replaced by quiet fear, and even old Tom stopped grumbling long enough to truly look at Elias. When he finally opened his eyes, they held a depth none of them had seen before. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the mountains. Something was calling him back, something tied to the drought, to the wind, to his long-held silence. Rowan was the first to understand. Elias wanted to go to the mountains. He asked why, but Elias could only shake his head. Words remained trapped inside him, pushing against whatever had sealed them away. Lyra exchanged a worried glance with Tom, knowing the path was dangerous, especially during the drought. Mira, however, stepped closer to Elias as if ready to follow wherever he went. Elias looked at her with a softness that spoke more than any voice. She believed in him even without answers. And for the first time in years, he felt the faintest spark of courage rising inside him. The wind rose gently as if urging them to move. Elias inhaled deeply, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel fear. He felt purpose. Rowan offered to fetch supplies, eager to prove himself. Old Tom grumbled, but admitted someone had to keep an eye on the boy. Lyra promised to prepare medicines for the journey. Mira simply smiled at Elias, her trust unwavering. Elias looked at the mountain path, and the warm wind brushed against him again like a promise. Something awaited him there. Something that might break the drought. Something that might finally unlock his voice. And as he took one small step forward, the entire village seemed to breathe with him. The path toward the mountains felt heavier than the ground they had left behind. Dry leaves cracked under their feet as Elias led the small group forward, each step steady, but filled with quiet tension. Mira stayed close, her eyes darting between Elias and the towering peaks ahead. Rowan walked a few paces behind, trying to act brave while clutching the supplies he'd packed. Old Tom kept complaining about his knees, yet he refused to turn back. Lyra moved calmly, observing the land with the trained eyes of someone who had seen too many troubled seasons. The air grew warmer, the wind more focused, almost guiding them. Elias felt it pulling at him, calling him, whispering of a truth waiting in the mountains. They continued deeper into the trail, where the air thinned and the trees grew twisted from years of harsh weather. Rowan tried to spark a conversation to ease the tension, but the wind swallowed his words before they reached anyone. Mira hummed softly, a tune she didn't even realize she was repeating. Lyra paused often, touching the soil and frowning at how dry it had become. Old Tom grumbled that the land wasn't always like this, that something had changed long before the drought even started. Elias listened to all of it, but his attention kept drifting to the wind's soft hum. It sounded almost familiar now, almost like a forgotten voice trying to reach him. The trail opened into a quiet clearing where the wind circled them as if testing their presence. Rowan dropped his pack with a tired groan, and Tom followed with a long sigh, complaining that the mountain path was getting steeper every year. Lyra scanned the tree line, sensing something close by, something watching. Mira moved toward the center of the clearing, gazing up at the sky as though waiting for a sign. Elias felt his heart pounding harder. This was the place. He remembered it. The shape of the rocks, the curve of the trees, the exact way the wind spun in the air. A memory flashed across his mind, sharp and painful. He had stood here before. The night everything changed. Elias stepped deeper into the clearing, the wind circling him in a slow, spiraling dance. His breath grew uneven as he remembered the night he had lost his voice. The storm, the roaring wind, the feeling of being swallowed by something larger than himself. Mira moved toward him, sensing his fear. Rowan and Tom fell quiet, watching with wide eyes. Lyra approached carefully, her voice soft as she asked if he wanted them to stop. But Elias shook his head. He needed to face this place. The wind grew warmer, brighter, almost alive. It lifted Elias's hair and tugged lightly at his clothes, as if urging him to remember everything he had buried. The wind rose suddenly, powerful enough that everyone shielded their faces. Elias didn't move. He stood rooted, eyes filled with memory of a night when he had shouted a warning, a desperate cry for help. And then his voice vanished, ripped away by the storm. Mira reached him just as the wind softened again. She took his hand without fear, grounding him. Rowan rushed forward to help steady him, and Tom stumbled but stayed upright. Lyra called out, asking if he was all right. Elias looked at each of them, guilt and longing swirling behind his eyes. He opened his mouth. No words came. But this time he felt them rising, pushing, trembling, closer than they had been in years. The clearing settled into a stillness so deep it felt like the world was waiting for Elias to breathe. Mira stayed right beside him, her small hand wrapped around his with steady courage. Rowan hovered nearby, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Old Tom wiped his forehead, muttering that the mountain had always held too many secrets. Lyra knelt beside Elias, checking his pulse with gentle hands. Oh, she already sensed this was no simple exhaustion. Elias closed his eyes again, letting the soft hum of the wind wash over him. Memories flickered, shadows, shouts, the storm that had stolen his voice. He knew now that the mountain wasn't just calling him, it was reminding him. Something here was unfinished. A low rumble echoed from deep within the mountains, rolling across the clearing like distant thunder. Rowan stepped back in alarm, and Tom reached for him instinctively. Mira moved closer to Elias, sensing his rising fear. Lyra stood and faced the mountain wall, listening with tense concentration. Elias pressed both hands over his ears, but it wasn't the sound that frightened him. It was the memory behind it. That same rumble had filled the sky the night he lost everything. He tried to speak, tried to warn the others, but the words stayed trapped, shaking inside him like thunder without lightning. Something was waking in the mountain, and it wanted him to remember. The ground gave a soft tremor, and Elias stumbled forward. Mira caught his sleeve, keeping him upright. Rowan shouted for everyone to back away, but the tremor faded almost instantly, leaving only a humming calm behind. Lyra placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, grounding him. Old Tom whispered that the mountain had always taken more than it gave. Elias lifted his head with trembling determination. He walked slowly toward the center of the clearing, stopping at the exact spot where the wind circled strongest. The others watched in stunned silence. Elias wasn't afraid anymore. He wanted to face the memory that had chased him all these years. As Elias stood in the swirling wind, a sudden flash of memory hit him. Voices crying out, a storm ripping through the mountains, his own voice breaking in fear. He gasped, clutching his chest as the memory grew sharper. Mira ran to him and Rowan followed, ignoring Tom's warning to stay back. Lyra rushed forward as well, her steps quick but steady. Elias dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the force of what he remembered. The night he lost his voice hadn't been random. He had tried to save someone he failed to reach in time. And now the mountain's wind carried the echo of that night right back to him. The wind suddenly softened, curling around Elias like a gentle hand. He raised his face, tears gathering in his eyes. Mira's voice trembled as she told him that whatever he remembered, he didn't have to face it alone. Rowan knelt on his other side, offering quiet support. Even old Tom leaned in with concern instead of complaints. Lyra placed one steady hand on Elias's back and told him to breathe. Elias inhaled shakily, and for the first time, the pain didn't crush him. It opened something. A tiny sound escaped his throat. Not a word, not yet, but a beginning. Mira squeezed his hand and whispered that she heard him. Elias closed his eyes. His voice was returning. Elias sat quietly as the wind eased into a soft whisper around him. The others waited in a circle of gentle concern. Mira held his hand with steady warmth, while Rowan kept glancing between Elias and the mountains, trying to understand what came next. Old Tom muttered that the mountain surely had more to say, though his voice carried more worry than annoyance. Lyra observed Elias closely, noticing the way his breaths no longer trembled as much. Something inside him had unlocked. Small, but real. Elias lifted his head, listening to the wind with a calm he had not felt in years. For the first time, the memory no longer pushed him down. It was guiding him. Rowan asked softly if Elias remembered something important. Elias didn't answer with words. He simply placed a hand over his heart, then pointed toward the mountains. Mira's eyes widened as she realized he wanted them to go deeper, farther than before. Old Tom groaned at the idea, insisting the mountain paths grew dangerous past this point. Lyra studied Elias's expression and saw the quiet certainty there. Whatever truth he carried had been trapped inside him for years, and now it was leading him forward. Elias pushed himself to his feet, shaky but determined, and the wind rose just enough to carry them onward. They continued upward, the terrain growing steeper and the wind stronger. Rowan led the way over rocks and roots, eager to prove he could handle the climb. Old Tom followed slower, complaining but refusing help. Lyra supported Mira when the ground became uneven, though the girl insisted she could manage on her own. Elias moved steadily, guided by a pull he no longer resisted. Every gust of wind seemed to speak more clearly now, carrying echoes of the night he had lost his voice. The mountain was calling him toward the truth, toward the place where everything had changed. They reached a narrow ridge where the land dropped steeply on one side. Mira's breath caught at the view, wide and endless below them. Rowan steadied her, and Tom muttered that the climb wasn't worth breaking a neck over. Lyra quieted him with a look. Elias stood at the ridge edge, eyes searching the horizon. A sudden memory struck him. The same ridge, the same wind, a shout swallowed by a storm. His throat tightened. He reached for words, but found only trembling breath. Mira stepped beside him, offering her silent encouragement. Elias steadied himself. The memory was painful, but it no longer controlled him. Elias stepped forward onto the ridge's center, where a broken wooden post jutted from the rocks. Old, weathered, nearly forgotten. The moment he touched it, the wind surged with fierce emotion. Images flashed through his mind. A storm, a friend calling his name, his own voice breaking in panic before disappearing into the wind forever. Elias's knees wavered, but he did not fall. Mira grabbed his arm. Rowan rushed to his side, and Tom even reached out in alarm. Lyra urged him to breathe slowly, grounding him. Elias opened his mouth, and for the first time a sound formed, a weak, trembling whisper carried by the wind itself. It wasn't clear, not yet, but it was real. His voice was beginning to return. The wind around Elias softened, almost as if it were listening to him. Mira held onto his arm, her eyes shining with quiet hope. Rowan hovered close, trying not to show how shaken he was. Old Tom steadied himself on his cane, staring at Elias with a mixture of fear and awe. Lyra moved beside him, ready to help if he collapsed again. Elias lifted his face toward the sky, breathing deeply. He didn't run from the memories anymore. He let them rise. Every sound, every fear, every moment he had tried to bury. The truth wasn't trying to break him. It was trying to free him. A low hum rolled across the ridge, stronger than before. Elias pressed a hand to his chest as the memory returned fully. His friend calling for help, the storm stealing his voice as he tried to shout back. He had carried the guilt alone for years. Mira stepped closer and told him softly that one moment didn't define his whole life. Rowan added that sometimes storms take things no one can hold on to. Even Tom, grumbling quietly, admitted that no one could fight the wind on a night like that. Elias looked at them, every face filled with compassion, and felt something inside him loosen. The weight he carried finally cracked open. Then, without warning, the wind gathered again, gentle but insistent, swirling around Elias like a memory come alive. He inhaled deeply and opened his mouth. At first nothing came, just a trembling breath. But Mira squeezed his hand. Rowan nodded firmly, and Lyra rested a reassuring touch on his back. Tom held his cane steady, silently urging him on. Elias tried once more, this time not fighting the fear. A small sound escaped, thin, fragile, but real. And then another. His voice, hidden for so long, pushed through the silence like a seed breaking through dry soil. The wind carried the sound across the ridge. Elias tried again, and this time the sound grew stronger. Shaky, uneven, but finally, a word. One single word, carried by the wind. Help. It wasn't a cry of fear anymore. It was a release. He wasn't trapped in that night. He wasn't powerless. He had found his voice again. Mira's eyes filled with tears. Rowan let out a stunned laugh, and even Tom stood speechless. Lyra smiled softly, her relief shining bright. The wind slowed as if satisfied, brushing gently across Elias's face. The mountains felt calmer now, almost grateful. Elias sank to his knees, overwhelmed not by pain this time, but by freedom. Together they helped Elias rise to his feet. The wind softened into a gentle breeze that carried a promise down toward the village. Mira leaned into Elias's side as they began the walk back, Rowan keeping close as support. Tom muttered that the village wouldn't believe a word of this, and then chuckled quietly at the irony. Lyra walked ahead, confident that the drought would soon break, now that the mountain's silence had been lifted. Elias looked back at the ridge one last time. This time, he felt no fear. His voice had returned, and with it, the weight he carried for years finally faded. As they started down the path together, the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, soft, gentle, and full of hope.